He was born to rule a nation. She typed letters in a London office. When they married, two governments, his own empires and the apartheid state rising next door, ruled their love a threat to be crushed. Britain exiled him from the land he was destined to lead, all to stop a white woman from becoming his queen. Yet this is no fable. His face sits on the banknotes of a country he would one day govern. What could an exiled prince and an office clerk do against an empire? He was born to rule a nation. She typed letters in a London office. When they married, two governments, his own empires and the apartheid state rising next door, ruled their love a threat to be crushed. Britain exiled him from the land he was destined to lead, all to stop a white woman from becoming his queen. Yet this is no fable. His face sits on the banknotes of a country he would one day govern. What could an exiled prince and an office clerk do against an empire? In the dry heart of southern Africa lay Bechuanaland, a British protectorate of cattle and Thornveld. There ruled the Bamangwato, a people of 250,000 souls, and their king was a boy. Seretse Khama had inherited the throne at 4 years old when his father died. Until he came of age, his uncle Chiketi would rule in his name. His name carried weight. Seretse's grandfather was Khama III, a Christian king so revered that in 1895 he sailed to London himself to beg Queen Victoria to keep his land out of Cecil Rhodes's grasp. He won. The Bamangwato remembered. Their kings crossed oceans to protect them. Seretse was raised to be such a king. So they sent him to be educated for the crown. School in South Africa, a degree at Fort Hare, then a voyage to England, Balliol College at Oxford, and law at the Inner Temple in London. He was tall, easy-mannered, quick to laugh. London was meant to be preparation for the throne. It would become something else entirely. Half a world from Seretse, in a quiet corner of southeast London, lived Ruth Williams. Born in 1923, she was ordinary in the way history rarely notices. During the war, she had driven ambulances through the Blitz for the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Afterward, she took a clerk's desk at Lloyd's of London. Steady, unremarkable, English. To understand why their meeting would shake governments, you must see the year. It was 1948. In neighboring South Africa, a new government had just taken power on a single promise: apartheid, separation of the races, written into law. A white woman and a black African, in love, would soon be a criminal act across that border. And Britain did not want to anger South Africa. Britain's reasons were not sentimental. They were gold and uranium. South Africa's mines fed the empire's wealth and the West's new atomic bombs. Bechuanaland itself was poor, landlocked, and nearly surrounded by South African territory, dependent on its powerful neighbor for trade, for rail, for survival. To keep Pretoria happy, London would sacrifice almost anything, even a king. Two people, two worlds. A dry African kingdom, a gray London office. Between them stretched empires, oceans, and the hardening color lines of an entire century. They had never met. There was no reason they ever should. A future king, groomed for a throne in the Kalahari, a young Englishwoman, insured cargo passing across her desk. Everything in the world, law, race, distance, empire, was arranged to keep them apart. And then, on one ordinary London evening, a missionary society held a dance. It was June 1947. The London Missionary Society, the same society that had once sent preachers to Seretse's grandfather, held an evening dance. Seretse went with his cousin. Ruth came with her sister. In a crowded hall of strangers, the future king of the Bamangwato and the clerk from Lloyd's found themselves talking. What they talked about was jazz. They both loved it. The records, the rhythm, the American swing that had crossed the same ocean they never should have. She knew the music. He knew the music. For one evening, color and crown fell away, and there were only two young people who did not want the conversation to end. They agreed to meet again. So began the most ordinary of courtships, in the most impossible of circumstances. They walked London together. They went to concerts and to church. He was charming and serious. She was warm and unafraid to be seen beside him. Friends noticed how easily they fit, as though the vast gap between their worlds did not exist for them at all. Within a year, Seretse asked Ruth to marry him. He did not hide what it meant. He was not a private man free to choose. He was a king, bound to a people who had waited nearly 20 years for him to return and rule. To marry Ruth was to risk his throne. He asked anyway. She said yes. She knew what she was choosing: a husband a continent away and the anger of two governments. What kind of love weighs an empire and marries anyway? Word reached Seretse before the wedding did. Seretse Khama, the uncle who had ruled as regent for 20 years, was appalled. A white wife, he believed, would divide the tribe and hand South Africa a weapon. He ordered his nephew home to give her up. Seretse refused. The first storm broke inside his own family. In London, the pressure grew. The bishop, leaned on by the government, refused to allow a church wedding. So Seretse and Ruth did the plainest thing possible. On a September day in 1948, they married quietly at a registry office. No cathedral, no crowd, 2 witnesses and a signature. In the eyes of the law, they were now husband and wife. They had crossed the first line. A king had married the woman he loved, against his uncle, against a bishop, against the mood of an empire. For a moment, in a small London office, they had won. But the news was already traveling south, to Seretse, to Pretoria, to Whitehall, and the powers of the world were about to answer. South Africa reacted with outrage. A black king with a white queen ruling just across the border was everything apartheid was built to forbid. Pretoria warned London plainly: recognize this marriage and risk the alliance. Within a year, South Africa would make such marriages a crime on its own soil. The couple had become an international problem before they had unpacked. That summer, Ruth sailed to Africa to join her husband. She arrived in Seretse a stranger, a young Englishwoman set down in a dusty royal town, watched by thousands, wanted by almost no one in power. Seretse's supporters were cold. The British officials were colder. She had left everything she knew to stand beside a man his own uncle was fighting. Picture her first nights in Seretse, 10,000 miles from London. A husband under siege, a tribe divided over her face, and not a single ally. She stayed. The tribe would decide the matter the old way, in the Kogla, the open-air assembly where every man could speak. Seretse called the people together. He was a formidable orator, and at the first gatherings the elders leaned his way. Give up the foreign wife, he argued, or give up the throne. Seretse stood before his people and would not. Then came the third Kogotla, in June 1949. For days the people argued in the sun, and slowly the mood turned. This was their king, the grandson of Khama the Great, and they would not let London or an uncle choose his wife. When the vote came, the assembly roared for Seretse and for Ruth. The people had chosen. It should have been the end, but the decision no longer rested in Seretse. It rested in London, where a nervous government watched South Africa's mines and South Africa's timber. The tribe could crown Seretse. Only Britain could let him rule. And in secret, Britain had already decided the answer was no. London ordered an official inquiry into Seretse's fitness to rule. The judges did their work and reached the wrong conclusion for the government. Seretse, they found, was fit to be king, so the report was buried. It would stay secret for 30 years. Publicly, ministers called him unsuitable to rule. It was a lie, and they knew it. In 1950, the government made its move. Seretse was invited to London for talks, given assurances of safety. It was a trap. Once he arrived, he was told he would be barred from his homeland for 5 years. Later, they made it permanent. A king, summoned under a promise, was locked out of his own country for the crime of his marriage. Ruth was still in Seretse, pregnant with their first child. Their daughter was born while Seretse was trapped in England, a father kept from his newborn by an act of state. Thousands of miles apart, a young family had been broken across 2 continents, not by any court of law, but by the fear of powerful men. But something unexpected happened in Britain. The public was not on the government's side. Newspapers took up the couple's cause. Members of Parliament rose in anger. Ordinary Britons wrote letters asking how a free country could exile a man for whom he loved. The exile meant to quiet a scandal had created a far louder one. For 6 long years, Seretse and Ruth lived in exile in England, refusing to break. He could have taken the easy road, abandoned the throne quietly, or abandoned her. He did neither. They raised their children, kept their marriage, and waited. And across the world, his people refused to accept any other man as their king. Slowly, even the family wound began to heal. Seretse and his uncle Chekadi, who had fought so bitterly, made their peace. The old regent came to accept Ruth. The division apartheid supporters had counted on, the split between king and elder, closed. The Bamangwato were no longer divided over the marriage. They were united in wanting their family home. By 1956, a way home appeared, but it carried a terrible price. Britain would let Seretse and Ruth return to Bechuanaland on one condition: he must renounce the throne not only for himself, but for his son. The kingship his ancestors had held for generations would end with him. Home or the crown, he could not have both. He chose. Seretse Khama gave up the throne of his fathers for himself and his heirs so his family could go home. A king laid down his crown. In 1956, Seretse and Ruth Williams Khama came home to Seretse not as king and queen, but as private citizens. The crowds that met them were vast. The man who had been exiled for loving the wrong woman walked back into his homeland at her side. The empire had taken his throne. It had not taken her. But Seretse Khama was not finished. Stripped of a crown, he found a new kind of power: the ballot. If he could not be king by birth, he would lead by the will of the people. He began to build something the region had never seen: a movement to carry his poor, landlocked protectorate all the way to independence. The gap that was meant to destroy him had not. He had lost a throne and kept a wife, lost a title and kept a homeland. And now, out of the wreckage of exile, he was reaching for something greater than any kingship his ancestors had known. The impossible marriage had become the foundation of a nation. The cost had been real. Years of exile, a lost crown, a childhood their eldest daughter spent with a father barred from her side. Ruth had traded London for the dust of the Kalahari and belonging for the long ache of being watched. They had paid in full and were still, after everything, side by side. In 1962, Seretse founded a political party and threw himself into the work of nation building. He traveled the country by car over rough tracks, listening to cattle herders and villagers. Ruth stood beside him through all of it. The former clerk from Lloyd's had become the trusted partner of a man now shaping a country's future. Consider the arithmetic. A woman gave up her country. A man gave up his crown. Together, they were to gain something neither was born to, a nation of their own. By the mid-1960s, the empire that had exiled him was letting its colonies go. Bechuanaland's turn came, and the man Britain had once branded unfit to be a tribal king now stood ready to lead an entire independent country. The judgment of 1950 had been not only cruel to a young couple, it had been simply, provably, wrong. On the 30th of September 1966, a new flag rose over the land once called Bechuanaland. It had a new name, Botswana, and its first president, chosen by his people's votes, was Seretse Khama, the exiled king, now Sir Seretse, with Ruth beside him as First Lady. The couple the world had tried to erase now led a nation. What Seretse built would astonish the world. Diamonds were discovered, and unlike so many leaders, he used the wealth for schools, clinics, and roads rather than himself. He kept Botswana a working democracy while dictatorships rose all around it. The poor protectorate became one of Africa's rare success stories. The exiled king had become a founding father. Through the presidency, through the building of a country, the marriage held. For more than 30 years, Seretse and Ruth stayed exactly what they had been at that London dance. Two people who did not want to be apart. Whatever apartheid had predicted, whatever empire had feared, their union simply endured, quietly, at the center of a new nation's life. In 1980, Seretse Khama died in office, still president, still married to the Englishwoman he had risked everything to keep. He was mourned across the world. Ruth did not leave. Botswana had become her home as surely as it had always been his, and she would remain there, Lady Khama, for the rest of her life. How do we know this story is true and not a fable polished by time? Because the proof is everywhere in Botswana. Seretse Khama's face looks out from the nation's banknotes and coins. His name marks the airport, the day of remembrance, the founding story every school child learns. A love once outlawed is now printed on a country's money. And the lie was exposed. Decades later, Britain's secret files were opened. The buried inquiry came to light. The one that had found Seretse fit to rule all along. Historians could finally prove what the couple had always known. They had been sacrificed, knowingly, to keep a racist neighbor content. The record convicted the men who exiled them. Their legacy did not end with their deaths. The son whose royal claim Seretse gave up, the boy denied a throne so his family could come home, grew up to be elected president of Botswana in his own right. The kingship the empire had forced them to surrender returned, transformed, through the ballot box the family had chosen instead. Ruth Williams Khama lived on in the country she had adopted, honored as one of its mothers. She died in Botswana in 2002 and was buried on a hill above Seretse, beside Seretse. The clerk from Lloyd's, once warned she would never belong, rests today in the soil of the nation her marriage helped to make. History's most unlikely loves, and everyone is true. This one is carved on a hilltop, printed on banknotes, written into a country's birth. Set it all beside the year they met. In 1947, a black king and a white clerk could not marry in half the world without breaking a law. By the time they were laid to rest together, they had outlived the empire that exiled them and the apartheid that damned them. Love did not merely survive the divide, it buried it. We build so many walls between one another, of class, of color, of borders and law, and every age insists its walls are permanent. Yet here were two ordinary people who met over jazz records and simply refused to believe the wall between them was real. Walls like that have a way of looking eternal, right up until someone walks through. Ask yourself one question. If the whole world stood against the person you loved, every law, every power, every border, would you have crossed it too? Seretse and Ruth crossed it, and a nation grew where the wall had stood. There are more of these true, impossible loves, buried in old letters, court records, and the founding stories of nations. If you'd walk across the divide for love, stay with us. We'll keep telling the ones that really happened, every single time.